All throughout the month of March, we've been exploring the life of one of the Bible's most remarkable figures, Abraham. And all throughout the book of Genesis, his story is told, and it's a story marked by triumphs and failures, and above all, it's a testament to the unshakable faithfulness of God. You know, he didn't part seas like Moses. He didn't, reign over a kingdom like David. He didn't call down fire from heaven like Elijah. But Abraham holds the unique place in all of Scripture as the patriarch of God's people and the one through whom God's covenant was originally given. The New Testament holds him up as a prime example of faith. The book of Hebrews chapter 11, many of you are familiar with, where it talks about all these people who did all these amazing things by faith, devotes more pen and parchment to Abraham than to anybody else. And then you've got, Paul, who writes in the book of Romans about justification by faith, and he uses Abraham as his prime example. And then again, James, the brother of Jesus, writes about faith that works, how works are a necessary part of faith, and again uses Abraham as the prime example. And so we see Abraham as held up as like the archetypal example of a life of faith. And this faith didn't come immediately. It was a journey. And in week 1, we saw the beginning of that journey, how Abraham responded to God's divine call, leaving his homeland, how he faltered in Egypt by lying about Sarah, and then how he resolved this conflict with Lot through humble generosity. In week 2, we saw Abraham's faith deepen a bit. We witnessed his courage in rescuing Lot from captivity. We saw his encounter with Melchizedek, this mysterious figure who may very well be Christ himself. And then we've got God's reaffirmation of his covenant, reminding Abraham that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars. But Abraham's journey wasn't a steady climb of faith. Like us, he was human, and his faith journey was like a roller coaster, full of highs and lows, capable of incredible trust and tragic compromise. And today we come to one of his greatest failures. We'll see Abraham compromise his moral integrity, the painful consequences that followed, and finally God's merciful response as he once again reaffirms his covenant and consecrates Abraham in a rather unique way, reminding us that despite all of our failures, God's faithfulness never wavers. So let's start by looking at Abraham's compromise, his compromise. 10 long years have dragged by since God first promised Abraham that he would become the father of many nations. And just imagine how those years must have felt, waiting, hoping, and clinging to faith, as every day that passed made that promise seem a little bit more impossible. And last week we saw how Abraham wrestled with honest doubt, and he went to God and he said, look, I don't even think I'm ever going to have a son. And God assured him that yes, you would have a flesh and blood son of your own. But Abraham wasn't the only one carrying the weight of this promise. His wife, Sarah, also longed for a child. And as the years slipped by without a single glimmer of hope, Sarah's heart grew heavy with grief and frustration. And can you imagine the ache of her watching her dreams fade while her husband kept reminding her of God's promises? Bitterness took root, resentment built up, and finally, Sarah concluded that if God wasn't going to come through for her, that she would just have to take matters into her own hands. As her story unfolds, we read in Genesis 16, this is verses 1 through 4. Now Sarah, Abram's wife, had not been able to bear children for him, but she had an Egyptian servant named Hagar. So Sarah said to Abram, "The Lord has prevented me from having children. Go and sleep with my servant. Perhaps I can have children through her." And Abram agreed with Sarah's proposal. So Sarah, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian servant, and gave her to Abram as a wife. So Abram had sexual relations with Hagar, and she became pregnant. Sarah, she believed God's promise that Abraham would have a son, but she couldn't see how that could possibly happen through and with her. Blaming God for her barrenness, she comes up with this plan that seems culturally acceptable in her day, even if it was completely outside of God's design. And in the ancient world, it was not uncommon for a barren wife to give her servant to her husband as a sort of surrogate mother to carry a child for her. But just because this was acceptable by culture doesn't make it right in God's eyes. And Abram, who should have led his wife with patient faith and unwavering trust, passively agreed. Just like Adam in the garden, he listened to his wife without questioning or seeking God's guidance, without being the spiritual leader that God made him to be. He took the easy way out, choosing the path of least resistance instead of the path of steadfast faith. And this was more than just a lapse in judgment. It was a profound failure to trust God. They let fear and impatience cloud their faith. And as a result, they compromised not only God's promises, but their own integrity. You know, today, you might not struggle with wanting to take a second wife. Most of us can barely handle the one that we have. But we do struggle all the time with this trap of compromise when our faith is tested. You know, we try to force God's promises to come to pass on our terms rather than trusting in His timing. You know, when the weight becomes unbearable, we look for shortcuts, whether it's bending the rules at work to get ahead, or cutting corners in a relationship, or making morally questionable choices just to make life easier. But compromise never leads to blessing. God calls us to wait patiently, to trust Him fully, and to refuse to compromise, even when the promises seem delayed. In the moment that we take matters into our own hands, we invite chaos and conflict into our lives. And instead of finding the fulfillment that we crave, we end up tangled in consequences far more painful than the waiting ever was. And that's exactly what happens to Abram and Sarah. As this sordid affair plays out, Scripture highlights the consequences of their actions, Abraham's consequences. Now, it doesn't take long for Abraham and Sarah's compromise to come back to bite them. Sometimes the fallout from our choices is immediate, and in this case, the consequences were swift and bitter. Picking up right where we left off in the very same verse, verse 4, so Abram had sexual relations with Hagar, and she became pregnant. But when Hagar knew she was pregnant, she began to treat her mistress Sarah with contempt. Then Sarah said to Abram, "This is all your fault. I put my servant into your arms, but now she's pregnant and she treats me with contempt. The Lord will show who's wrong, you or me." I love Sarah, don't you? It's almost ironic. Sarah, who had been so determined to force God's hand, is now blaming Abram for the results of her plan that she concocted. She blamed God for her barrenness, and now she's blaming Abraham for her conflict with Hagar. And the very plan that she devised backfires, and she's left feeling bitter and betrayed. This is human nature at its rawest. You know, when our schemes don't go as planned, we're quick to shift the blame. This is your fault. It can't possibly be my fault, even if it was our idea in the first place. And Hagar, meanwhile, she's not completely blameless either. Once she realizes that she's pregnant, she begins to look down on Sarah with contempt. Imagine being in Sarah's shoes, watching another woman carry your husband's child, and then feeling like you have failed him, you failed God. It's no wonder that tensions just boiled over in this family. As tempers flare and accusations fly, Abram does what he did before. Nothing. Instead of stepping up and taking responsibility, instead of asserting himself as the spiritual leader and trying to make peace in the situation, he takes the path of least resistance again, telling Sarah, just handle it however you see fit. And this results in Sarah treating Hagar so harshly that this pregnant servant runs away, just flees into the wilderness to escape her mistress's cruelty. But God doesn't abandon Hagar in her distress. He reaches out to her. An angel finds her by a spring and gives her a promise that she will bear a son named Ishmael, who will be wild and untamed. He says, your son's hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand is going to be against him. He's going to be a fighter, and he's not going to get along with anybody. But in that moment of fear and loneliness, Hagar is amazed that God sees her. And that's what she says in this passage. She says, I have encountered the God who sees me. And that meant everything to her. Being seen by God. With renewed strength, she returns to Abram and Sarah's household, and in time she gives birth to Ishmael. Of course, the story doesn't end there. It's not like the three of them live happily ever after in this weird relationship. Years later, the consequences of Abraham's compromise continue to echo throughout the family. And after Isaac is born, which we'll get to next week, tensions rise again between Hagar and Sarah. And eventually, Hagar and Ishmael are sent away for good. Abram loses his son, the boy whom he thought would be, his heir, because he tried to take matters into his own hands instead of trusting God's plan. And the lesson here is sobering. When we compromise our faith and our moral integrity to get what we want, we often lose much more than we gain. Whether it's having an affair or making shady choices for career gains or manipulating other people to get what we want, the temporary relief of control can never outweigh the long-term pain that follows. God's way may seem slower and harder and more uncertain, but it's always better than forcing our own solutions. When we step outside of God's will to achieve our own goals, our own ambitions, we may end up sacrificing what really matters to us. God is gracious, even in the midst of our failures, but that doesn't erase the consequences of our choices. Abram and Sarah's decision to take a shortcut didn't just impact them, it shaped generations to come. Like to this day, there is conflict in the Middle East between the descendants of Ishmael and Isaac. When faced with the temptation to compromise, we would do well to remember that short-term solutions can lead to long-term problems. It's better to wait on God than to rush ahead and live with regret. Fortunately for Abraham, we serve a God of second chances and third chances and fourth chances. So despite Abraham's failings, the next chapter focuses on and reveals Abraham's consecration. His consecration. Despite Abraham's moral missteps and moment of faithlessness, God remains gracious and unwavering in his promise. Abraham's failure didn't cancel God's faithfulness. Just as he did with Abraham's doubts in the previous chapter, the Lord reaffirms his covenant, reminding Abraham that his plans have not changed. God speaks to him with a powerful declaration in chapter 17, verses 3 and 4. This is my covenant with you. I will make you the father of a multitude of nations. What's more, I am changing your name. It will no longer be Abram. Instead, you will be called Abraham, for you will be the father of many nations. I will always be your God and the God of your descendants after you. In this remarkable moment, God doesn't chastise Abraham or remind him of his failures and mistakes. Instead, he shows remarkable grace, declaring that his promise still stands. I am still your God. God doesn't give up on Abraham, even when Abraham gave up on himself. And the change from Abram, which meant honored father, to Abraham, meaning father of many, wasn't just a change of name. It's a declaration of God's unwavering purpose. Despite everything, Abraham is still going to be the father of many nations. And God isn't done. He also shows his kindness and compassion towards Sarah, who had not only doubted but blamed God for her inability to conceive and orchestrated the whole debacle with Hagar. In an incredible display of grace, God doesn't just cast her aside or condemn her for her misgivings or missteps. Instead, he lifts her up, reminding Abraham that his promise extends to her too. And so we see in verses 15 and 16, regarding Sarah, your wife, her name will no longer be Sarah with an I. From now on, she will be Sarah with an H. And I will bless her and give you a son from her. Yes, I will bless her richly, and she will become the mother of many nations. Kings of nations will be among her descendants. God's faithfulness reaches beyond Abraham to include Sarah, showing that he sees her, he cares about her, and he intends to bless her richly despite her failures. God's grace not only restores but renews, giving Abraham and Sarah new names, new identities that align with his ultimate plan. And as a sign of this newly confirmed covenant, God instructs Abraham to perform a symbolic act of consecration, circumcision. Every male in his household, whether born or bought, was to be circumcised as a physical reminder that they were set apart for God. It was a mark of belonging, a tangible sign of that intangible internal commitment. And today we don't practice circumcision of the flesh as a sign of our covenant relationship with God. Instead, Paul writes that we experience a circumcision of the heart through faith in Jesus. In Colossians chapter 2, verse 11, he writes this: when you came to Christ, you were circumcised, but not by a physical procedure. Christ performed a spiritual circumcision, the cutting away of your sinful nature. God's ultimate goal wasn't to mark Abraham's descendants with a physical sign, but to transform hearts, both then and now. And just as Abraham was called to set himself apart from the world, we too are called to live differently, not through external rituals, but through inward transformation. When we follow in Abraham's footsteps and we allow Christ to circumcise our hearts, we demonstrate that we belong to him. You know, the old ways are cut away and we're set apart for God's purpose. Abraham's story is it's a powerful reminder that even when we fail, God remains faithful. You know, he doesn't abandon us or his promises. He doesn't give up on us. Instead, he calls us to renewed consecration, to lay down our compromises and to let him mark our lives, our hearts, with his grace and purpose. Abraham's journey is a vivid portrait of faith marked by both triumph and tragedy. And today we've seen how Abraham's compromise, taking matters into his own hands, led to painful consequences that rippled through his family for generations. And yet, despite his failures, God's faithfulness never wavered. In this act of gracious faithfulness, the Lord reaffirmed his covenant, giving Abraham and Sarah new names and consecrating them for his purposes for their lives. The story of Abraham reminds us that even when we fail, God is steadfast. You know, our compromises may carry consequences, but they don't cancel God's promises. He still calls us to set ourselves apart, to let him cut away our old sinful patterns and to mark our hearts as his own. Next week, we'll continue our journey with Abraham as he compassionately intercedes for Sodom, but then once again gets caught in a web of deception. Don't miss it. In the meantime, if I can help you take that next step in your journey of faith, whatever that step might be, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. You can call me at home. My phone number's in the back of the bulletin. You can pull me aside and talk to me after church, or you can just come forward while we stand and sing together. Let's sing, church.